Steve, how are you?
I'm good. It's nice to be here. Thank you for having me. It's
No
great.
worries. Yeah, I'm really excited to have you and to finally have a chin wag. But before we get going here, you know what? As everybody knows, I try to start my episodes off with a good joke. And truthfully, I tried to find an excellent chemistry joke, but all of the good ones are gone. Argon. Argon.
Wow.
Chemistry.
That's worse than I thought it was going to be.
Was it really? But this can be a two-parter. It's like I tried to tell a chemistry joke, but there was no reaction.
Oh, that one's worse.
Is it worse?
Wow.
Or a twofer, as we call it in Canada. We call it a twofer. Perfect. Oh my goodness. Hey, everybody. Welcome to What Magic Is. This is a podcast about magic, the occult, the esoteric, the paranormal, the supernatural, and the weird. My goodness, we have an amazing show for everybody today. You might be a little bit confused if maybe you've heard some of my more recent episodes, because a lot of times I will have a guest on the show and they will do a lot of the talking, and I'm just kind of in the background flinging a question. I recently did an episode about hypnagogia where I did a ton of the talking. So a lot of the times you don't really know what you're getting with it. So for this one, I'm going to be doing a lot of the talking as well, but I also have a fantastic guest, somebody who has been a patron for a long time. And this show in particular, it's going to be a bit more collaborative. We're going to have a lot of perspectives, and this is going to be a really fun one because we are back at the Fool's Gallery. And a Fool's Gallery is where we have an individual who has added their own idiosyncratic take on magic or the occult or the esoteric. And I got to say, even within the Fool's Gallery, we have like a strata in which I call the Titans of Magic. And this individual is a Titan of Magic. And as I was doing research for this episode, I realized this man has, like, I would almost say more than John Dee. That might be a bit controversial, but I think more than John Dee has influenced European magic and esotericism and folklore and everything in a way that is unparalleled. So for this episode of the Fool's Gallery, within What Magic Is This, we are going to be talking about Paracelsus. Now, for those of you who do not know, we are talking about a gentleman by the name of Philippus, Aureolus, Theophrastus, Bombastus von Hohenheim. But he was known as Paracelsus, who was better than Celsus or Celsus, who was a Roman physician. Now, before we get started here, how will his name be pronounced? Because a lot of times people will say Paracelsus. I've heard it said if there's actual true Latin, it would be Paracelsus. I've even had people reach out to me to say in German, it is Paracelsus. My goodness. Steve, how will we pronounce this man's name?
I'm just going to be Paracelsus.
Paracelsus?
I'm not going to try.
Okay.
Good Midwestern boy.
Okay. All right. Paracelsus. I think I'm going to try and I might ping pong back and forth between Paracelsus and Paracelsus, because what's weird is that as I was reading about his life, is he really didn't like Latin. He would do lectures in German, which pissed people off. So in his time, he would have been known as Paracelsus, but he might have been more towards the like Paracelsus or Paracelsus camp. So yeah, who is this person? So here's the thing though, Steve, because I do polls up on the Patreon as to what topics people want to listen to on the podcast, I do a poll. There's about 15 items there, and Paracelsus was high up there. And as soon as that came out, you went on the Discord and you were like, oh, if you do Paracelsus, can I be on the show? And I said, we'll see. And it all transpired that, let's talk about, I reached out to you. I was like, let's talk about Paracelsus. And so I have to ask you, why do you want to talk about this guy?
I think you mentioned it really well when you were just like, he's a Titan. Like, there is a man who I don't think has influenced just the weird trajectories of my own magic than just Paracelsus in general. He's a nexus of classical alchemy into more modern alchemy and chemistry. He bridges medieval grimoire traditions and folklore, takes everything into like the lodge style systems while also influencing the Paracelsian grimoire traditions that go later. Like, what a wild man, to say the least.
Yeah, it's crazy. All right. So who is Paracelsus? Again, ping-ponging back and forth. He was pretty much the first, and this is debatable, he was pretty much the first medical theorist. And some would say he was the founder of pharmacology, homeopathy, antisepsis, and wound surgery. He actually wrote the very first treatise on occupational illness for miners of people. So the people who work in mines like silver mines, gold mines, tin mines, ore mines, that kind of thing. As Steve mentioned, he was also an alchemist / chemist. Again, chemistry became from alchemy. A lot of people will be like, the very first, I forget his name, Borden. It escapes me right now, but he's the founder of modern chemistry. But alchemy, chemistry kind of held hands until chemistry kind of went ahead and just really said, we're going to do our own thing. He was also a theologian. He had a lot to say about religion. He was a contemporary of Martin Luther, who was around in Germany at the time. He was a philosopher, and dare I say, the reason he's on the show, he was a magician. Now, he touches so many aspects of the occult, and we will go through all of this. But some have said that our understanding of medicine would not be what it is today if it were not for him. Some consider him a pillar of medicine. And here's the thing that I found out recently is that Paracelsus had the second largest body of writing in German in the 16th century, second only to Martin Luther, who was the founder of Protestantism. If you don't know who Martin Luther is, you might need to know who Martin Luther is because an enormous figure. But as I said, yeah, Paracelsus, gigantic figure. And if you are in the occult and magic, you need to know about Paracelsus. He is insane. It's big. It's so big, a titan of magic. And as I said, I think his influence after going through this episode is larger than John Dee's. Everybody wants to go to John Dee, but Paracelsus, his purview after his death was enormous. It took a while basically until Casaubon reignited the interest in John Dee, but Paracelsus, since his death, is just exponential growth, huge influence. So it's crazy. Shall we get into, did I get everything, Steve? Is there anything else you wanted to add? Just kind of like on the periphery about an introduction to Paracelsus?
I think you got it. I will say, like, those Pseudo-Paracelsian works, like, the amount of volumes that there are is just mind-boggling. You sent me a casual list that was 365 pages long of just references. Yeah. And, like, his influence just truly astounding.
Yeah, we'll get into the pseudo-Paracelsian thing that occurs a little bit further on down the line. And here's, I think, something that I want to maybe put out here. I'll give a little paradigm as to how the show is going to go. So we're going to be talking about the life and times of Paracelsus. We're going to be talking about, and further, all of these start with M because I'm trying to be a little bit cheeky and I like alliteration. So we're going to go through the man, the medicine, the magic, the myth, and the matters as to why Paracelsus matters and why we need to know this person and why you, the listeners, should know about him. Yes, the life of Paracelsus. So to begin with, I want to talk a little bit about the times. And this is very important to understand. Our medical understandings as they exist now is very modern. So when we are talking about Paracelsus, he was around in the 15th century. Being treated for illnesses in 15th century Europe was pretty much the same as being treated for illnesses in the 5th century BC. It was quite stunning. Now, I don't want to make too much of a point of it, but if you do not know what humors are and humoral theory, it was what was used to diagnose people. There's this whole hot and dry and cold and wet thing. And I can't, Steve, are you familiar with humors at all?
Yeah. So you've got your yellow bile, black bile, blood, and phlegm.
Yes.
Am I correct on those? Yeah. And it's related to your elemental theories. You got hot and dry, wet and cold, hot and wet, and cold and dry. There we go. We got them.
That's the
it's actual science at the time. This isn't the weird psychologized version of temperaments or anything. No, it's like you had too much blood in you. We need to take out the extra blood.
Yeah, and doctors at the time, they would judge things like the taste of your blood, the taste of your stool, your poop. The doctors would actually taste this, and they would diagnose if something was out of balance. And to treat that, they would use the opposite to try and make things better. Or they would also do, as Steve alluded to, what was called venesection. Some of you might have known this because, I don't know, maybe the youngins have watched things like Horrible Histories or something like that. But barbers originally, they would bleed you. Barbers would cut you and bleed you for this humoral theory, right? And a lot of times they would do it, particularly in Europe, on an auspicious day, most commonly a feast day for a particular saint. Yeah, so when it's the saint's feast, that's when they cut you open and take out some of your blood. It's really, it's the history of medicine is wacky, particularly in Europe. Surgeons themselves, they were apprenticed for the most part. Like a plumber, you would follow around the surgeon and you'd see how they operate, and then you would eventually apprentice under this, and then you yourself would be a surgeon. But I want people to understand this. For over 1,000 years, almost 2,000 years, medicine was pretty much almost the same in Europe as it always had been. That's 2,000 years of the same kind of medical theory. And then folks started to do things differently. And one of the folks themselves was Paracelsus. So let's talk a little bit about the life of Paracelsus. So he was born in Einsiedeln. I hope I'm pronouncing that right, in Switzerland. Was that right, Steve?
I have no idea. We'll go with that.
We have somebody in the Discord who actually lives in Switzerland or lived in Switzerland, so maybe they might give us a slap on the wrist. Anyways, but Einsiedeln in Switzerland in 1493. So just as we're starting getting into the 16th century. So his father was a doctor. His mother was a bondswoman of the Benedictine order. So we just did a saints episode, if you know about Saint Benedict from that. So his mother was a bondswoman within that. She died fairly early on in Philippus's life, but yes, as I said, he had a huge name, Philippus. And also, I want to put a pin in his name as well. So this is a myth you might come across, is that the name or the word bombastic comes from his name, because we'll get into it, because he was an interesting chap. That's a complete myth. Anyways, Bombastus was a name that was old. The word bombastic does not come from his name. Let's just get that out there. Anyways, his father, of course, taught him medicine because he was kind of like apprenticing his son. His family moved because of war to what is now Austria. All of his chemical and medicine understandings for a long time was based from what his dad taught him. He eventually apprenticed at a mine. So he would work at a mine as one of the people treating people there who were ill. He also did a bit of mining himself. What was happening in Austria at the mines was that a lot of miners would get very ill. They get very, very sick. And a lot of them would have coughs, and what we would later learn would be things like pneumoconiosis and stuff like that, particularly within coal mines. But we'll touch on that a little bit later. There was also these beliefs that there were earth spirits in the mines that were making people ill. Here's where things get a little bit more mythological. Some say that he studied under the Black Abbot, which is Trithemius. I've read things that say yes. I've read things that say no, but that Trithemius was more of like, Paracelsus read Trithemius and he kind of like considered him like a spiritual advisor. I'll have a link up in the show notes to something that a champion of Paracelsus, who's a contemporary magician by the name of Frater Acker, he goes into this relationship between Paracelsus and Trithemius. I think for the most part, if Trithemius was in Austria, it was a very short period of time. And again, a lot of mythology around this guy. He got his medical degree from Ferrara, apparently, although there's zero record of this. And Ferrara did a pretty good job of keeping track of who was and who wasn't a doctor. Either he gave a different name or, there's no record of him. But something that stayed with Paracelsus for the majority of his life is that after he got his medical degree, he traveled. He just traveled a ton. I'm not going to pull up the list of like where he traveled to. Russia. He spent time in England at tin mines in England. Some say he spent time in Egypt to learn alchemy in Egypt. Apparently, he went all over Europe, Italy, Spain, all these places. But for most of his life, Philippus, he was he was itinerant. He was always traveling around, and much of his work was as a hireable surgeon for the army. There are lots of, in the 15th or in the 16th century, lots of war, lots of combat. And he would learn how to do surgery. This is one of the things that people need to realize. A lot of our medical breakthroughs occur through army surgeons and how to treat people and get them better quickly so that they can go back to war. Yeah, it's incredible. That's a very strange history. It's like one of those things where there's like two sides to war. One thing is like, yeah, it's really terrible. But another way, it helps people, particularly surgeons, learn a lot more about how to heal us and keep us healthy. So, but yeah, he would have been hireable as a surgeon to help people when there was war and combat. After he travels, he returned home to Austria and he began to put both of his magical and alchemical understandings together with his medical experience. And eventually he was accepted as a town physician in Basel, Switzerland. So he was what this did. So when you become a town physician, what this does for you is it allows you to lecture at university. And so for some people that'd be like, oh, great. I can teach the new generation. What occurred with Paracelsus is that he took the opportunity and he kind of did this thing where he's like, I've got a platform now, so I'm going to put all of my hermetic, philosophical, alchemical teachings, and I'm going to teach them this, the students, which pissed people off. They also preferred you to lecture in Latin. He did not like lecturing in Latin. He preferred to do it in German, which would be the common language, which pissed off even more people. But while he was in Basel, he cured a very important publisher, and he kind of like got a bit of a reputation as being like a wonder worker, like somebody who can heal only the most sick. This guy was really, really ill, and this was a very important, rich publisher in Basel, and he cured him, completely cured him. And his reputation grew. What he also did is pissed a lot of people off, and then he made matters worse is that he denounced most of what was being taught by his peers. Like at the university, he was like, those people are teaching shit. People that have been there for a long time. He was like, those people are teaching shit. Listen to me. And he also burned copies of medical books that were very popular at the time. And, you know, we tend to think in our somewhat, I'm going to say more progressive West, like burning books is a bad thing, but Paracelsus, he did do that a little bit. And he made a big thing out of it. He was a bit of a showman. Several events over a long period of time, basically, they added up, and he eventually had to leave Basel. He was worried that he was going to get arrested. He was worried that he was going to be persecuted and arrested and thrown in jail. And so he was like, up, bye, pew, poof. He threw the smoke bomb down and went away.
I was going to say, I think part of that too is Basel at the time is like a great upheaval. This is the middle of the Protestant Reformation as all these are going on. He was in contact with Erasmus, Reformed theologians, like there's everything going on in this city, like not just, hey, I'm going to be a bomb thrower. It's like social upheaval is everywhere.
Yeah. 100%. This is such a fascinating period of time, and I love it. I love it in Europe. If you want to read what's happening a little bit later, I believe in what become the Munster Rebellion. Like, if you want a situation which would show you just how crazy things were in Europe, look up the Munster Rebellion. Oh my goodness. Anyways, strange stuff. You can do a whole podcast about what was going on in Europe in the 15th and 16th and 17th century. But yeah, Basel, not just like a tidy town with one upstart being like, it's like it's social, not chaos, but just things are changing very quick and a lot of really new ideas. But yeah, you're completely right there. But yeah, he had to leave. He was like, I'm out. Peace. Threw down. And he probably had, because he was a chemist, he probably had like a smoke bomb. Right? At least I'd like to think so.
Little short, stocky man. Disappearing in a cloud of smoke.
Love it. He left, and every place he went, he could not practice medicine in an official capacity. His reputation preceded him, and more on his reputation in a little while. But he was always writing. He was always working. The way that he writes, we'll talk about it in a little bit because it's kind of funny. But he was always working, always writing, always traveling. Eventually, he found himself in Salzburg on the invitation of an archbishop there. It didn't last too long. He was in poor health. He wasn't the healthiest guy. Reason we'll talk about in a little bit. But in 1541, Paracelsus, he passed away. He wrote his will while he was resting on a traveler's cot at an inn called the White Rose. And then a few days later, surrounded by people talk about his death and about just surrounded by papers, surrounded by all of his works and whatnot. And yeah, he was only 48 years old. He was a pretty young guy. He wanted to be buried in St. Sebastian Cemetery. Why is St. Sebastian? That's an interesting choice of cemetery, Steve. Why St. Sebastian? Tell us.
Oh, well, nice patron of healers and all of this. Shot through with arrows, very fun. He has a weird iconographic tradition of being very dainty and pretty while being, stabbed through. But,
yeah. I just think I like that idea of, just suffering so many wounds over. Yeah, I think that might have had something to do with why Paracelsus wanted to be buried there. There was a rumor going around, as there will be, because he did die quite young, that he was poisoned. Right now, because we do have his bones, we don't suspect that there was any kind of foul play. His bones, I'll talk about it in a little bit, but his bones did have the skull was fractured, but that most likely happened later. What we do know from studying his bones is that he had 10 times the toxic level of mercury in his bones. So mercury was fairly popular for alchemists and those on the cusp of doing chemistry. But yeah, that might have had something to do with it. Again, mercury is a fairly toxic element. It's crazy, but he's surrounded by all of his work. Most of his work was unpublished until Johannes Husser released a collected works anthology in the late 16th century. Yeah, things exploded afterwards with many books over the next 300 years, some genuinely by Paracelsus, but tons, as Steve said, tons attributed to him, but not his words were published. There's very little recognition of his life in his time, but towards the end, there was like a couple of things that, there was a feast done in his honor, I think 2 or 3 years before he died. So there's a little bit of recognition, but and his reputation before. But what happened in 1945 is that during the American occupation of Salzburg, which is Hohenheim-Salzburg Fortress, in the final stages of World War II, soldiers there American soldiers raiding this fortress, they came across a secret door, a secret compartment, and they opened it up and there was this box there. And they took the box out and they were expecting to find like gold coins or some kind of riches. Nope, there was just bones. And they threw these bones aside. These were in fact the bones of Paracelsus. They had been saved. They'd been taken from St. Sebastian Cemetery. They were in a tomb there. And yes, they were saved in the castle, but yeah, thrown aside like a candy wrapper. Luckily, one of the people in the castle saved the bones and buried in St. Sebastian, where he is to this day. And there's a nice little obelisk to him in this cemetery. But that was the life. Very little recognition during his life, but as I said, his reputation in years going by just completely exploded. And yeah, he, as I said, second only to Martin Luther in the 16th century as far as papers published by him. So let's talk about the dude, the man. As Steve said, he was small. He was probably less than 5 feet tall. There is a theory that he might have been intersex, as his pelvis was characteristically female. Lots of rumors while he was alive and after he passed away that he might have been a hermaphrodite, or he might have had both male and female genitalia. There's also a story that he lost his testicles from a goose herding accident when he was younger. Seriously? Yeah. Anyways, there might have also been bones being mixed up when they found his bones in Hohenheim-Salzburg Fortress, that there might have been female pelvic bones that got mixed with his pelvic bones. We'll never know, but there were rumors while he was alive that, and there's no talk of him ever like having romantic relations with anybody. He was incredibly asexual for the most part. Yeah. Strange guy. Yeah. Again, to talk about this thing where this theory that the word bombastic comes from him, not true, complete myth. But the reason that this became a myth is that while he was alive, Apparently, he was an enormously righteous man. He considered himself above pretty much everyone else, that nobody was as smart as he was. So authors like Gary Lockman, who I love, they've made the comparison to Giordano Bruno, which eventually I would do an episode about Giordano Bruno, because he's also this really righteous character who everybody else was an idiot and a pedantic piece of shit. And he was just so much smarter than everybody. I think they say like he was basically Giordano Bruno with more drinking and more eating. I think he's more in line with a figure like William Blake for the most part. There was an acquaintance in Basel that said he was never sober for more than 2 hours at a time. He was most likely what we would consider an alcoholic today.
But here's the thing. Most people, if they could afford to be, most people back in the day were alcoholics. People just drank a lot.
And the way that he wrote, and the reason he has many acquaintances, and a lot of them wouldn't work with him for very long, is that he would dictate his books once he was done teaching in Basel, in particularly, that he would hire these people to come and freehand write. He would just get drunk and stuff his face with like foods and sweets and stuff like that. And he would just yell at these people and they would just write everything down for him. He wouldn't do, any writing himself. So he would just be like, here's my theory on this and here's my theory on this. And these people would be writing. That's how he would do things. And that's why there was like a lot of works, and he's just surrounded by all of his brain droppings, basically. But volatile temperament. People talk about him, just being really mean to other. Yeah, there's one quote, I forget what it is, but it's like, I forget what it is. It starts at the beginning of one of his biographies. Is like, I'm going to offend you. Don't take it personally, is basically what he said.
Oh shit. No, actually what he said is, I am different. Don't let this upset you.
Yeah. There's a woodcut of him done during his lifetime. It's a fairly famous picture, but for a reason a little bit later on, where he's pictured with a sword. He wanted to be pictured with a sword more than anything. I think this is he is fairly proud of his army surgery. He wasn't a soldier, but I think he was proud of the fact that he was able to help people. And he got a lot of his knowledge while he was working as an army surgeon. And I said, because there's a lot of fresh people to work on, right? But yeah, in his day, he was seen as a peasant by his superiors, which made it worse because he could give as well as he got. People would talk about him to his face, and he would talk right back at them. Yeah, they thought he was a low class piece of shit. And very powerful people, he would tell them off to their face and in front of their friends and their acquaintances. People do love making a lot about his anger and whatnot, but he genuinely seemed to care about health and people. Like, he wanted nothing more than to heal and to know what was inflicting people by any means necessary. I think one of the things that is really, really quite cool, and one of the biographies that I will list in the show notes, is what is interesting about Paracelsus is this embrace of opposites. So this is a little quote from one of the books about him. It says that he combined practices that were magical and empirical, scholarly and folk, learned and artisanal. He knew Latin, the language of scholars, but wrote and lectured in German. He read ancient medical texts and then burned the best of them in a public display of reproach. The most important text for any physician, he argued, was not one found in a library. Although raised in the Catholic faith, he was anti-papal, shared many views in common with Reformation theologians, and believed devoutly in a female deity, picturing Mary as a pre-existing spouse of God the Father within the sacred Trinity. In addition, he challenged the habits of conventional learning and educated behavior. He admired the know-how and insights of those who worked with their hands, such as miners, bathers, alchemists, midwives, and barber surgeons. And he taught his students to learn the medical art not on the basis of an ancient medical canon, but from experience. And this is the reason I love Paracelsus. Experience is the best way of learning, doing things yourself, and particularly as far as magic. And I tell a lot of people in the Discord, as Steve knows, is like, just try these things yourself. And if it doesn't work for you, just because it worked for me doesn't mean it's going to work for you. Try them out. Just try everything. But he learned from doing. And here's a quote. It's attributed to him. I don't really know if he said this, but I do love this quote. He said, "The universities do not teach all things. So a doctor must seek out old wives, gypsies, sorcerers, wandering tribes, old robbers, and such outlaws, and take lessons from them. A doctor must be a traveler. Knowledge is experience." That is from a text we might talk about a little bit later. But I don't think he really said that, but it's kind of like in line with the way that Paracelsus was.
Yeah, that weird line between man and myth just becomes really impossible, and you just have to kind of embrace Paracelsus, the spirit tradition vibe that comes as part of.
Yeah. He, when he does say things, it's a little bit more poetic. And here's something I don't think a lot of people realize about reading his works is that they're very, there's a lyricism to them. That's kind of, it's particularly when they're translated to English. Obviously I don't read German, but they're really fun. At least the stuff we know that he wrote, they're quite fun. They're quite cool. And I enjoy it. But he did stick up. He loved sticking up for the little guy, the dispossessed, the working people. That was where he gained a lot of experience. The soldiers, those were it. And this is a quote that is something that he did write. He says that nature has not made me subtle, nor have I been raised on figs and white bread, but rather on milk, cheese, and oat bread. And therefore I may well be uncivil to the hyper clean and the super fine. For those who were brought up in soft clothes and we who were brought up among the fir cones do not understand each other well. Thus I seem rough, though to myself I appear gracious. How can I not be strange for one who has never gone wandering in the sun? It's a bit of a slight, but I like that. It's just like, it's like these people that are telling us about all of this stuff, like they've never experienced the good life and the traveling life anyways, and hanging out with the good people, the real people. But what emerges from every bio one reads, there's about 5 really good biographies of Paracelsus, is that he's a complex figure. He's a definite seeker. And yet another person who was not understood and hated the fact that he wasn't understood in his time. But yes, he cared. He cared about people. He cared about helping people. He cared about trying to find what was ailing people. And he probably cared a little bit too much. He could have very easily, like when he was in Basel, he could have very easily just done and towed the line, but he chose not to. And he suffered for it.
He was a populist through and through on some level. The fact that he is burning books by Galen because he's like, no, I treated Martha down the street and this doesn't work. Really just points to how much he really thought that you had to live a life to be able to apply knowledge.
100%. Yeah. I love the guy. Really interesting character. Again, what Steve said is 100% is that there's this part of Paracelsus that is very mythological. And there's this part that is like what we know he said, and they really do blend together in some way, more so than any figure I've encountered. I mean, Crowley, I think is close because there's a lot of things that Crowley wrote about himself that are very patently untrue. There's a lot of things that have been written about Paracelsus that are not true, but it kind of all myth and fact. That's our territory. So we have to decide what is. But yeah, in the spirit of Paracelsus, there will be a lot of things that we can touch on. So let's dive into the next M, which is the medicine. So Paracelsus's approach to science was very much informed by his philosophical, alchemical, and magical beliefs. They all go together, so it's really hard to separate them. There's this thing that a lot of people will talk about, that Paracelsus was an astrologer, and I go back and forth. I don't think this is as easy to answer to say like he was a true astrologer. I think astrology, it informed a lot of his understandings. I wouldn't call him a total, not in the way that John Dee was an astrologer. I think Paracelsus took the lessons of astrology and kind of combined them in with his alchemical and medical understandings. He has this thing called the inner ascendant, which I will have a link in the show notes to an essay by, or it's a downloadable ebook about Paracelsus by Frater Asher. It's really interesting. So look that up about this idea of the inner ascendant that goes along with the stars. But interesting guy. I don't know if I can call him like a true astrologer, not in the way that John Dee was, but astrology was part. Do you have any take on this, Steve? What do you think? Do you think he was an astrologer? Or?
I think he was fluent in astrology. I don't think he's probably casting charts for people kind of thing. No. We definitely know from some of his medical practice that, there were specific times that, certain stars affected certain things, and we would take that into account. But yeah, I don't think he's throwing elections for people anytime soon.
No. Yeah, it wasn't like with, again, because of the myth of John Dee. doing the coronation of Queen Elizabeth. It's a total myth. What he did is that people came to him and was like, is this a good time that we've decided? And he was like, yes. Like Paracelsus wasn't really doing that. We have no record of him doing anything like that. So he wasn't an astrologer as we would consider. I tend to think, but it was, as Steve said, I think he was informed. You kind of had to know about astrology to do anything back in the day. But as Steve said, as far as like the traditional knowledge of things like humors, Paracelsus said, fuck humors. Like he doesn't want to have anything to do with them. He thought it was nonsense from the get-go. This whole idea of, because humors is very much based on the four classical elements, earth, air, water, and fire. He said those were important, but merely foundational, because he found something that was like even bigger than that, in which we will go into in a little bit. But his understanding, because it was very much of its time, was very Neoplatonic. He did view matter not in like the way that it was dirty, but it was just like matter is a part of something bigger that we just don't understand. And he had kind of like a way of looking at these things that was very much his, that we will talk about little bit. But so he would be considered a hermeticist, but a lot of his hermeticism was very of his own. And it later on got kind of like shoehorned into what we would consider 16th century hermeticism. But yeah, very much influenced by things like Marsilio Ficino, and that whole kind of celestial Neoplatonic understandings. I'll say Renaissance Neoplatonic understandings. But yes, he was religious as well. And he saw that being a doctor, he said that being a doctor was divine. Being a doctor is a religious exercise. In some way, everything we do is divine. And we got to talk about this quote that is attributed to him, because it is one that we will come across always. And he had this quote because people said that his peers in Basel said that he was poisoning people. And his retort to this was that the dose makes the poison. And so what do you make of this quote, Steve? The dose makes the poison.
So basically, we know he died with a lot of mercury poisoning, potentially.
Yeah.
But he pioneered some techniques of using mercury in a therapeutic way. If you do not understand what mercury therapy could possibly be in any way, shape, or form, it looks like you're just feeding people mercury poisoning. And instead, what he's trying to get at is when you manipulate the particular material that you're using in a certain way and apply a specific dosage, then it can be helpful instead of killing you. We actually still apply this all the time. If you ever think about your dosages of ibuprofen, you're only supposed to take 800 milligrams a day, because that's when it stops being helpful and you start poisoning yourself. So it's actually a foundational part of pharmacology.
100%. Yeah. And it's one of those things that seems so simple to say. And a lot of people, particularly in our realms, I mean, I'm one of those people that homeopathy actually helped me when I was younger, but homeopathy operates off the same kind of ideas, that a little bit of what ails you, or in some way, like that's a really simplified, really dumbed down way of thinking about it in the homeopathic sense. But yeah, it's like sometimes there are things that are poisonous that we can take in smaller doses that are actually quite helpful. And this was one of the things that Paracelsus, this was his thing. Like this was what he did. And people beforehand, there was a bit of this around, particularly within Arabic understandings of medicine. And he might have come across this in his wanderings, but he was the one who kind of like introduced it in a big way in Europe. So, and toxicology as well is something that, he also was one of the ones, I think this is really important. He was one of the first people to kind of come out big and say that certain chemicals are taken in specific parts of your body. This will affect your liver. This will affect your kidneys. Beforehand, it was all humoric theory, and that the body, it was all digestion. It's 4 different layers of digestion. I think I'm screwing that up, but yeah, it's really crazy. And that's a great quote. It's one of the, it's pretty much the Paracelsian quote is only the dose makes the poison.
And both of those examples you pointed out were because of his time working in mines and on soldiers, where he was actually practicing medicine on real people. So this kind of like proto-scientific understanding that he had was entirely just from paying attention to what was actually happening to people instead of taking the works of Galen as gospel.
Yeah. Yeah, amazing. Here's a quote from Paracelsus is that the physician should proceed from external things and not from man. And a lot of people, when they hear that, they're like, oh, he's talking about germ theory before, perhaps. But also what was happening with humoral theory is that when somebody got sick, you would go to the patient and you would be like, why is this patient ill? It's something within the patient, something within their body, within like the shell of their body itself that's making them ill. Paracelsus is like, no, there's probably some part of the environment has a part to play in this, right? And yeah, you could say that germ theory didn't start because there's always been a lot of people that have said that, but he made it a little bit more blatant, particularly because of his work with minors. He's like, these people are getting very ill all in the same way. Little people, larger people, the color of the hair is all different. People's disposition is different. They're all getting ill in a similar way. It must be something outside of just their bodies, right? And so he would look at it. So I don't want to, because it's a really touchy thing nowadays. In a way, kind of a bit of terrain theory as well. But people can go both ways and say germ theory, terrain theory, and some sort. But I think that that's interesting. In a period of time when everybody would be like, "It's your body. Something's wrong with your body. It's out of balance." He was going like, "It might have something to do with where you are." Anyways, great stuff. Paracelsus, he wanted to say, he was one of those ones, again, medical theorists who'd be like, let's look at all the parts that are happening around. He was very big on that. So yeah, really cool, really interesting. And this sounds thoroughly modern in a time when it really wasn't, right? He was big into the integration, as Steve said, of the integration of chemistry into medicine. And this was completely revolutionary. It didn't start with him, but he was very influential in its uptake, and particularly the uptake of what were called Paracelsians after his death. But yeah, there's so much to go off with this guy. I've talked about him before in my healing episode with Ivy. I talked about it in my alchemy episode with my friend Patrick. He gave us the name zinc. He probably identified hydrogen first. He was the first to connect goiters to minerals. In an age of cure-alls, Paracelsus was very much about prescribing certain things for certain things. And at one point, it was just like, take this, it'll make everything better. He was like, no, take this for this thing. He was one of the ones who's like, if you have poor blood, probably should get more iron into your diet. Imagine that. One thing that was really, really big for Paracelsus, he doesn't get a lot of newer biographies are talking about this, is that healing baths and baths for certain things. That was a lot of that was because of the promulgation and the ideas of Paracelsus. While he was alive, he was huge on like prescribing baths and certain things. And I know nowadays we think that's kind of stupid, but it did help. For some things, it actually really did help. It's not a go-to these days. We'll probably give you pills, but for a lot of people, baths and mineral baths and even water cures, it's a big thing in Germany. Going for water cures for certain things is mental health. A lot of people are starting to circle back to this. He was big on what we would call now psychosomatic afflictions. He could be, in a way, a forefather of psychology. Carl Jung certainly thought so, but he was also like, he said that there are such things as diseases of imagination. That's the word that he uses. There's diseases of imagination. And this was at about the time, I think, was he a contemporary of Weyer, Johann Weyer? I think he was a bit before Weyer, but he was like, there's some people aren't possessed by demons. They just are mentally ill. And yeah, he, I think, was one of the very first ones to be like, there's people who think that they're ill and they're probably not. And in some way, they might just be mentally not well. And again, the theory of mind wasn't a really big thing at the time. Psychology didn't exist. So this would have been a bit of a precursor of this. I think the biggest thing, as far as his medicine is concerned, is his work in antisepsis. I hope everybody knows what antisepsis is. Steve, what's antisepsis?
Basically treating wounds in clean environments without causing increased infection by touching everything and using topical chemicals and compounds to make sure that those wounds stay clear and clean.
Yeah. So Paracelsus was known as a bit of a wonder worker in his day. And I think a lot of this comes down to just the way that he would treat people's wounds. There's stories, and if you can find these documents of their 16th century documents looking back at the 15th century, they would treat wounds with feces. They would treat wounds with certain kinds of animal dung and stuff like that. And the worst thing you can do to a wound is put poop on your wound. It'll just give you an infection. And this was something I think a lot of the idea of because there were stories of Paracelsus going to towns and curing people of plague. There's, of course, the story in Basel of the curing the publisher there. But when he was a doctor, an army surgeon, he would literally just be like, make sure your wound is clean, make sure it gets some fresh air. If it oozes, change the bandages. And these people would get better.
I mean, to illustrate how absolutely revolutionary it wasn't until 1847 that surgeons had like standardized hand washing.
Right?
It was potentially miraculous just to be like, oh, things don't just get worse. What a novel concept.
Right? Paracelsus was huge on just being like, if you have a wound, keep it clean, change the bandages. That's it. And yeah, a lot of times when people were wounded, they asked like tons of shit, put a ton of shit on it. And it's just like, Paracelsus is like, if it's a small thing, just let it be and keep it clean. That's all. Anyways. Yeah. Yeah. There's these stories also. I don't know if you came across this, Steve. There's a story also of, I don't know if it's true. It might be apocryphal, but he was in this town and he had an argument with like the people at the university in this town. And so Paracelsus had they had a competition. This sounds monstrous in this day and age. They had a competition as to who could cure the most lepers. And the story is that like he cured 9 out of 15 lepers and the university could only cure like 2 out of 15 or something like that. Anyway. Yeah. Yeah. Anyways.
Things that we probably wouldn't do anymore.
No.
But props to him for figuring out that you could, affect leprosy with medical advice.
Right. So I think, again, that goes down to his approach on antisepsis. So there's this idea that we have now of holistic health and that everything is connected. But what did Paracelsus actually believe? And so this is from, I believe I picked this up from like Wikimed or something like that. Very interesting. But he said, they say Paracelsus pioneered the use of chemicals and minerals in medicine. His hermetic views were that sickness and health in the body relied on the harmony of man, the microcosm, and nature, the macrocosm. He took an approach different from those before him, using this analogy not in the manner of soul purification, but in the manner that humans must have certain balances of minerals in their bodies, and that certain illnesses of the body had chemical remedies. As a result of this hermetical idea of harmony, the universe's macrocosm was represented in every person as a microcosm. According to the insights of the time, there were 7 planets in the sky, 7 metals on Earth, and 7 centers or major organs in man. 7 was a special number. Everything was heavenly and closely interrelated. Diseases were caused by poisons brought here from the stars, but poisons weren't necessarily something negative, in part because related substances interacted, in part because only the dose determined if a substance was poisonous or not. Evil could expel evil. Therefore, poisons could have beneficial medical effects. Because everything in the universe was interrelated, beneficial medical substances could be found in herbs, minerals, and various alchemical combinations thereof. Paracelsus viewed the universe as one coherent organism, pervaded by a unifying, life-giving spirit, and this in its entirety, man included, was God. So yeah, that's a good way of putting it. I think it's very broad in his understanding. We could do a whole episode about Paracelsian understanding of macrocosm and microcosm because it was very important to him. But in a nutshell, that is a very good way of looking at it, particularly the idea that the poisons are put here by stars and stuff like that, which is why a lot of times people think that he's a bit more of an astrologer than he is. But I think astrology informed his understandings. Anyways, as I mentioned, there's this idea of Paracelsianism. So after he died, a lot of works were produced that had his ideas, particularly collected works of him by Johann Husserl. There was this thing where a lot of people started reading his work and it became really, really big for a very short period of time. It didn't last as long as a lot of people make this idea that Paracelsus was huge and he stayed huge until they found chemistry. It kind of like exploded and then fell apart fairly quickly. But yeah, it didn't last. It didn't go very much further than like the mid 17th century for the most part. There was a lot of people that became followers of Paracelsus.
Yeah, huge in the first half of the 17th century. The latter half, not so much.
Great stuff. Interesting to look at. But the reason that everybody is here is because of the magic of Paracelsus. And as I mentioned, like all figures, particularly the Titans of Magic, a lot has been written about Paracelsus and how he viewed magic and the world. Trying to solidify what he actually thought is rather difficult, and made even more so by the amount of work and documents which were attributed to him after he passed away. So I'm going to try for the most part to stick with what we do know. I love myths. Myths are great. Myths are fantastic. But what we do know about what Paracelsus said, I want to try and stick with that for the most part. So, Steve, what is natural magic?
Natural magic, since we're doing quiz time now.
Yeah.
Basically, it was a theory of magic that by the properties and states of literal things in the world could be arranged in such a way to produce what you wanted. So this is your astrological image magic. This is your herbal magic, stones, minerals, all of that. You could just kind of tweak where they were and what they were doing and when, and then the thing would happen.
Yes, exactly. Couldn't put it better myself. Yeah, this was heavily influenced by Marsilio Ficino, who I would do an episode on for sure at some point. Really interesting cat. But what's interesting about what Steve just said about natural magic. So here's part 2 of quiz time. What is technical hermetica, Steve?
Gosh, I hate the definition of technical hermetica. Yeah, it's like, well, applying hermetic ideas to the practicalities of the real world. I don't know. Basically, you're just trying to pull together your macrocosm and microcosm in such a way as they align in the way that you want to do it. So this is your alchemies, your talismanic arts, all of these kind of things.
Yeah, for sure. And if you pick up something like the PGM, like a lot of the Greek magical papyri, a lot of that stuff, which is particularly more to do with like healing and stuff like that. There's not a ton of them, but they will have like these odd things where they ask you to do certain stuff. And that's kind of, when we squint, that's kind of like the first evidence we have of some kind of a technical hermetica emerging. But as time went on, it got, as Steve said, it got a lot more astrological, got a lot more alchemical. And so Paracelsus is interesting because he's kind of wed the natural magic. He wed natural magic with technical hermetica in a big way. And it's really incredible. And as I said, Neoplatonism was the map of how Paracelsus's worldview came together, particularly like Ficino Neoplatonism. Or Platonism. I get people have written me like, you don't know how to pronounce Neoplatonism. I don't give it.
Fuck the Platonists.
Yeah, that's right. Fuck the Platonists for sure. But it's one of those things where I think that was the map that Paracelsus used, but for the most part, and again, it's because I like it, he did view the universe as being alive. He thought that everything was alive and that there were spirits all around us. And so the territory for Paracelsus was very animistic. I mean, I wouldn't say he is an animist pure and pure, but the way that he viewed spirit and each cell, he thought each cell of our body had a spirit. It's really quite incredible. Again, I have this one. There's a wonderful essay. It'll be in the show notes. It's called On the Foundations of Animistic Spirit Practice in Paracelsus's Work by Frater Asher. Please look it up. It's really interesting. It's really wonderful. He talks about the divine ascendant as a spirit as well. Very cool. He thought that the world was awash in spirit some way. So one of the big things that magicians will make a lot of, and you'll see it all over, particularly with people that, I'm not going to say they don't know alchemy, but maybe they're just influenced by alchemy because they read one book written in like the 20th century about alchemy.
Drag them.
Is that Paracelsus is the one who introduced what's called the 3 principles, which are salt, mercury, and sulfur. So as we were talking about the 4 elements, Paracelsus, this was his big. This is a big idea for as far as European alchemy is concerned. So, Steve, what is your take on his Paracelsian, the 3 principles?
So alchemy, unlike what everybody thinks it is, was never a unified specific theory from the beginning of having simply just salt, mercury, and sulfur. Sometimes it was salt only, which I think was John Dee's theory. Sometimes it's mercury and salt, all of this. But he Paracelsus himself was like, no, it's all three, and it's each material has all three, not in a there is literal sulfur, literal mercury, and literal salt and everything, but the volatile part of things, the stable part of things, and the combustible part of things were your salt, mercury, and sulfur specifically. His specific introduction technically was spagyrics. I'm never going to pronounce that word correctly, which is a particular type of plant alchemy I have experimented with before. It's kind of fun just to
really?
You don't let your things explode while you're fermenting them, but it is very fun. And it's a particular technique that Paracelsus and some of his followers developed of trying to isolate parts of plant material to allow you to extract the salt, sulfur, and mercury out of them into their constituent parts, remix them, and thereby making them more potent.
Oh, incredible.
Yeah, so you reduce everything to ash, ferment it, reconstitute it, just to make like that part of rosemary that is solar more solar.
Cool. That's awesome. Wow. Yeah, I love that. Yeah, this is so, as Steve mentioned, this is not, the alchemy does not have a unified, it's not one thing. Yeah, people have to understand. Alchemy is this crazy, wonderful, particularly European alchemy. It's all over the place, and it's not just like puffers and like practical, like the people trying to find gold and stuff like that. It's each person kind of brings their own solution to the party. If you'll excuse a really terrible pun, but here's one of the best things I found about what Paracelsus, in a way, the more philosophical, alchemically philosophical area covering salt, mercury, and sulfur. This is from Nicholas Goodrich Clark, I believe, in the book Paracelsus, The Essential Readings. He said, Paracelsus accorded essential importance to sulfur, salt, and mercury as the three principles of which all bodies consist. One would be mistaken if one thought that Paracelsus was referring here to the chemical substances known as sulfur, salt, and mercury. He used these terms to denote principles of constitution representing organization, sulfur, mass, salt, and activity, mercury, all varieties of the specific forms achieved by the immanent intelligences and semina of matter. But Paracelsus also used the terms in a chemical context. Sulfur represents the combustible, mercury the smoky or volatile, and salt the unchangeable component of any natural object. These principles are disclosed when the element or cover is removed. For instance, when a piece of wood is burned, one sees flame, sulfur, smoke, mercury, and only ash, salt, remains. These principles of constitution, together with the complex scheme of intelligences, I can't go into Paracelsian intelligences because it's vast. There's 4 of the major ones, volcanism being one of them. Volcanic, anyways. It's vast. It's vast. Do you know about the intelligences, Steve?
Only vaguely. There's so much there.
Yeah, there's a lot. Okay, I can't go into it. Please look it up. Anyways, but they are the dominant concepts in Paracelsus' theory of matter, energy, and the process of life, while the ancient elements are relegated to a secondary function as matrices, vehicles, or even mere covers for the active spiritual forces. Yeah, there's a lot to go on here, and it's something to look into. He was very big into it. And since when he died, a lot of people made a lot of the 3 principles. I don't know if Paracelsus would be happy with the way that people have no, I don't think people would.
My general assumption is he wouldn't be particularly happy with what most people were ever doing, but
yeah. So again, a lot has been made of this, and particularly a lot of, I don't want to shit on them. A lot of lodge magic makes a lot of stuff out of the 3 elements because it's lovely to have a little 3, a trinity. Like, and he was also big on the idea of his religious stuff, his theological stuff was big onto trinities, and he really enjoyed them. And this trinity made a lot of sense to him. Let's talk about pretty much mine, and having talked to you a little bit earlier, Steve, your favorite part of Paracelsus. So let's talk about the elementals. So what? Not quiz time, but what are the elementals, Steve? So it's weird that this guy out of nowhere, because we're talking about alchemy and medicine. What are Paracelsian elementals?
So they're spirits, kind of. They're like people, kind of.
Right.
They're maybe an in-between. Maybe, kind of. They might be fae. Who knows? The weird thing about the way that Paracelsus talked about the elementals, which we all know, or not all of us know, whatever, your salamanders, nymphs, undines, and sylphs, is that they are constitutive spirits, intelligences, things of the elements, fire, water, air, and earth, that have bodies, no souls, embody the specific ideas of what their element is, but aren't. It's this weird conflation of a lot of unclear folklore that he knew from just living life into weird theories of his own particular stuff that end up like blossoming everywhere. So you get like your salamanders and gnomes, because they are masculine elements, are primarily men, and your sylphs and undines are primarily women, because things. People would assume gnomes are most like us because they're earthy and we are solid things, but Paracelsus thinks the nymphs are the most like us because they move through air, just like we do. So, it's this fun little thing that you just get to explore and play with. And I think that play is actually the biggest part of it. If you read his book on the nymphs, that is his biggest writings on the elementals themselves. It reads like a fairy tale. They are alive and very real and playful and personable in a way that his random musings on alchemy are not.
Right. Yeah. It seems because it's not a very big, we're not talking about like a book. It's fairly short, but as Steve said, it's very, Paracelsus talks about them. And here's the thing. Okay. So Steve was right. Paracelsus thought these things were real. It's not that they're like these imaginary, because if you read people that came after Paracelsus, particularly people like Eliphas Levi, it's like this idea that they're like theoretical elementals. Paracelsus thought they said they were real. He didn't think he said they were actually real. And for a guy who was like, these miners talk about earth spirits while they're in the mines, but I know they're not getting sick because of them, but also they're real. Like it's something, it's tough for people to really lock their heads around. But Paracelsus said they were real and that they're like humans, except they don't have a soul. They're creatures of God. They're just like us, but they have no soul and they want to. I'll make this comparison. Okay, so just like us, we move through the air, we can swim in the ocean, right? But we are nourished by root vegetables, which we take from the earth. We are kept alive by water, elements that we enjoy. For nymphs, they live in water, but they are nourished by earth and air. Sylphs, they live in the air, but they are nourished by earth and water. Gnomes, or as Paracelsus called them, pygmies. Interesting. I believe pygmies comes from Greek. Anyways, it doesn't matter, but or from Greece. Gnomes, earth, they're nourished by water and fire. Elemental salamanders, the salamanders, they are from fire and they are nourished by air and earth, right? So they all kind of have this dance or interchange of how they occur. But no soul. Steve, how did these things try to get a soul?
So Paracelsus has one very specific way that they gain souls. He never says it's the only way, but through the Christian sacrament of marriage to a human, specifically a sylph could gain a soul. But, we can probably extrapolate this to all of them. Right. This is actually where Hans Christian Andersen gets his theory for the Little Mermaid, down the line, because Paracelsus's random musings on the elementals were so informative and broadcast everywhere in Europe. It just became standard understandings. So, Ariel is an undine. She's a mermaid, but, an undine, and wants a soul and falls in love with a human and goes up there, and gosh darn it, she doesn't get her soul, so she's ready to just die, but then she becomes a spirit of the air and only has to work for 300 years to be able to get a soul.
If you haven't read the original Little Mermaid, it's nothing like the Disney version. It's nothing. Yeah.
But yeah, so theoretic, like part of this whole elemental tradition kind of influences broader spirit work post Paracelsus as a retributionist or redemptionist kind of understanding, where part of the reason spirits work with us isn't just this one-way tradition of like, I have bound you by the holy names of God and threatening you with a black knife of iron. It's instead that part of the way that they become truly themselves is the work with humans, in the same way that part of the way that we become fully ourselves is by work with God and spirit.
I love that. That is like, it's one of those things where, particularly when people get into Solomonic magic or grimoire-based magic, they're like, these forces, these spirits have to work with me because I command them. And a lot of people found that really icky. I don't, but I don't think you do either. But another way of like looking at this is this Paracelsian way, is that some of them are just trying. Okay, so again, they're spirits of God's creation. They're not devils or demons, the way that Paracelsus looked at them, and they're trying to become human. They want a soul, and it's not like we're trying to like we're gatekeeping them. It's like we're helping them by involving them with our magic. Is that too much of a stretch, Steve, do you think? Or
no, I don't think so at all. I'm actually, you brought up Wire earlier. I forget which demon in his list has it in there, but one of his spirits in his catalog literally says he was promised a soul over so many years of labor and was lied to. So like this was something that like immediately hit in like Goetia all the way into your quote unquote high magic.
Yeah, it's an incredible way of looking at things. And this is where, when Steve and I were talking earlier at the beginning of the episode, Paracelsus is within so many strata of, I'm going to say, European ritual magic. It's not blatant in like the way that, it's just like, oh, but we're taking that from Eliphas Levi and like lodge-based magic. This is way before that. It's very unique, very subtle. But once you're able to actually look at it and see it and recognize it, it's like, this is some crazy new ritual, like not new, but it's a wonderful ritual idea. And yeah, I love it. And Jake Stratton-Kent has made a lot of work, particularly within the Testament of Cyprian the Mage.
The third and final book in his Encyclopedia Goetica series.
Wonderful stuff. More and more folks are starting to look at this elemental spirit interaction that we've had since Paracelsus, being like, this is a very interesting kind of Goetia, or sort of Goetia, that has been neglected and usurped by more flashy ways of interacting with spirits.
And I think it also helps show, like, when you talk about Golden Dawn, Lodge magic stuff, and they're like, oh, the elementals and levies, like, they're the kind of like weird idea of these elements. And instead, if you go back to where they're coming from, which is all of this Paracelsian stuff, you can be like, well, actually, this is just a specific way for me to interact with the spirits of the world. They are kind of nature-y, kind of not. And for the most part, because they are like us, they're kind of ready and willing to just kind of be there. It's a practical step in Paracelsian magic that doesn't require any like real highfalutin stuff.
Yeah. A lot of people will make, and you use the word nature spirits and stuff like that. There's debate as to like whether or not nature spirit equal fae kind of stuff, or fairies. And that's a whole other episode, but yeah,
it's a podcast and I'm here waving hands.
That's right.
That's a useful thing to everybody out there. But you just kind of, I love resisting the weird categorization of spirits in general. So I think this is a useful corrective. They're not angels, they're not demons, they're not fae. They just kind of are what they are. Yeah. And they're defined primarily by the medium which they move through.
Yes, I love it. It's wonderful. And for those who don't know, we're going to cap this off to talk about the elementals with a little bit of trivia, some extra notes to tack on here. Paracelsus gave us the word gnomes. Mm-hmm. That's like, for people who do not aware, like it's Paracelsus who came up with that word. So when you have those in your garden or whatever, it comes from nomos. And then I believe it was Alexander Pope who translated it to gnome as we get it, but I could be wrong on that. Don't hold me to that. Anyways, this whole tradition of European, this folklore, spirit practice, it's his and his alone. Like, we can all talk about like the Enochian angels and John Dee, and I think a lot of that is like, a lot of it's people going back, but it was homespun. He didn't create them, right? Because he was fairly well traveled, and when he would work on ships and stuff like that, he'd hear, or near ships, they'd hear from the people working on the boats, the people in the mines. Like he took all these stories and he created not the spirits themselves, but he identified them in some way. And yeah, it's really quite incredible. And we're going to talk a bit about a book that, if you are a magician and you do not know about this book, you should learn yourself. It's called Comte de Gabalis.
In English, The Count of Kabbalah.
It was published in 1670. It was anonymously published, but we found out recently it was written by, not recently, but we've known for a while, it was written by Nicolas Pierre Henri Montfaucon de Villars, who was a French abbot, 100% influenced by Paracelsus. The stories in here, it's hard. Have you read this book?
It's one of my favorites.
Is it? Okay.
So it's potentially a satire.
Yeah.
It could have just actually been making fun of this weird Paracelsian folkloric tradition. But like I said about Paracelsus on the nymphs being much more of a like fairy tale, personable, playful version of his own writing, the Comte is exactly the same. It's taking all of that meat that Paracelsus had started with and just kind of blew it up into basically a full theology of the elementals. And I love it. It's so much fun. If you have at all any interest in early modern storytelling, I think it's something you should absolutely read.
Yeah, I've only read segments of it, and it's kind of mind-blowing because when you read it, you can see, and I hope this doesn't sound like I'm throwing shade, but I might be. A lot of people took this book and kind of Umberto Eco Foucault's pendulumed it into like ritual magic. Edward Bulwer Lytton, this was a huge influence on a lot of his writings, hugely influential, this book. And I haven't read it. I was reminded for doing the research for this episode because Jake Stratton-Kent makes a big deal out of it. And it is one of those books where some people, like Blavatsky, Levy, and Manly Palmer Hall, they took it a bit more seriously. They gave it a bit more, heft than probably the author wanted. But yeah, interesting book. Apparently the Count of Kabbalah, which is what the title is he says, I will teach you the secrets of magic. And by the end of the book, you don't know what the secrets of magic are. So
of course not.
No, that would be too much. But yeah, really interesting character, this abbot. And it was popular when it was published. Again, published in 1670, hugely popular. They got published a couple of more times right after its first printing. And then this dude was, this abbot, he was murdered, most likely by a family relation or somebody very close to him, about 3 years after this, the Comte de Gabalis, Gabalis was published. Interesting, but yeah, hugely influenced by Paracelsus. And then, yeah, from there, a lot of strange elemental stuff happens within European ritual magic.
Mm-hmm. And I'll defend Levy and Blavatsky a little bit here. I think it might have been one of those kind of books where the author had one intention and the story itself had a life of its own that just went a little above and beyond it. And I think it's because it was just so rooted in that Paracelsian tradition of just like, yeah, these are the elements or the elementals, and this is where it's going. Be like, yeah, you got it right. Good job. I know you were cracking a joke, but oops, I think it's true.
Yeah, I mean, I go back and forth on Blavatsky as far as she's got some interesting influences in what she chooses, as does Levy. Manly Palmer Hall is just kind of like, he just retells a lot of stuff in some way. But Levy and Blavatsky certainly, particularly for Blavatsky, spiritual magic, for Levy, for ritual magic. A lot of this stuff, yeah, we can't fault the idea that it got taken a little bit seriously, or at least it was kind of put into a lot of forms of magic, but people should probably know this book.
Read it. It's good.
Is it? Okay. Yeah. I should probably
get free. There's translations free online.
For sure. We've nearly talked about these things, these elementals, for 20 minutes, but is there anything else we missed about these things? I think it's really interesting that they don't have a soul, and yeah, it's crazy. The potential for ritual magic is quite crazy, particularly within a Paracelsian model.
Absolutely experiment with these guys. They're wonderful. Preparing for this episode, I decided to do a little more practical work and, ask the good elemental archangel Michael to find a little fire spirit for me, and look over and the candle flame is talking to me. They're little things, and they're very approachable.
Yeah. If you want to do ritual magic and spirit-based ritual magic, this is probably one of the better ways. There's another way that we might talk about as we talk about a certain grimoire a bit further on down the line, but is also influenced by Paracelsus. But yes, I agree with everything that Steve says here. There's this other thing that is interesting about Paracelsus and his magic. It was just, he has something called the inner firmament. I don't want to make this too much of a stretch because it was fairly unique to him. A lot of writers, particularly Gary Lockman, has made something of this, was that he kind of says that this is Paracelsus's way of doing what we would call, and I did an episode on it, an intelligence of the heart, a way of being able to utilize imagination to be able to see inside things and to decide how to see the core of things in some kind of a truth that speaks to you personally, and a way of perceiving things that is beyond just the surface level aspect of them, to see in them. And it was a way in which Paracelsus approached herbs and chemicals and minerals that this inner firmament allowed him to be able to see how these chemicals and where they might be able to be used to help people. And then he would test them on people to see if they would actually help. It's really quite interesting. But yeah, his understanding of microcosm and macrocosm, and this would aid him to be able to make these decisions. And it was a dance of understanding, I think, is a way of being able to say it. This is a quote from Gary Lockman in The Secret Teachers of the Western World. And I really like this about how he talks about Paracelsian inner firmament, is that this is imagination, the directed focus of the mind, throwing a spotlight on reality. This has a distinct noetic character. It shows the imagination as an organ of knowledge. It is through this that we can surpass given reality and surmount the solitude of the self, which, as Paracelsus, Emanuel Swedenborg, and other inner voyagers knew, can become an obsession bordering on madness. Imagination takes us out of ourselves by taking us into ourselves, into that greater self that Paracelsus and our other secret teachers had knowledge of and wanted to share. Paracelsus's true imagination is not an escape from reality, but a means of grasping more of it. So it's lovely. It all goes together. And for Paracelsus, he created his own world and his way of understanding, which was in some way, at least for medicine, it was very practical. We can say as much as we want about the magical side of Paracelsus, which is good for us, but his way of creating his world was also somewhat functional, and it was very influential in other realms as well. So that's very cool and interesting. For those people, though, that like, this all sounds great, I want to work with the elementals, it's awesome. But that being said, you are not going to find a book that says the magic of Paracelsus. This doesn't exist. His magic was dispersed within the pages of what he wrote, and it's somewhat hard to pick out and ritualize for yourself. There's some help. There's people like J. Stratton Kent and others, and Freder Osher, who are kind of doing a bit of a good job of trying to come up with some kind of a Paracelsian ritual magic. But yeah, there is no real book of like Paracelsus's magic. Some would say there is, but we're going to get into that a little bit later, because some people will say, what about the Archidoxes of Magic, which is a book that is apparently attributed to Paracelsus? which leads us into the second last of the M's.
The myths.
As Steve mentioned, there are a lot of works attributed to Paracelsus. I found this appendix within a book, and it's 340 pages of the works attributed to Paracelsus, which aren't things that he wrote. It's quite staggering. And there is one of these called the Archidoxes of Magic. What do you make of this thing?
It's wild.
Yeah, it's fun. It's really fun.
If you want your picatrix of Paracelsian magic, this is it. And, it's got basically any kind of medical talisman that you could ever want. There is an amazing episode of Esoterica about it that you highly recommend people should watch if they really want to dive deep into it. You get fun things like treating a sword with blood from a wound to heal the wound, which
right.
Sure.
Or
an erectile dysfunction talisman. Maybe I'll need to pull that out in a few years. Who knows?
It's called, what is the actual name of it? It's the member of generations, I think, is the name of the spell for impotence. And it has this really badass talisman called the Trident of Exorcism? No.
Something like that.
That's the name that people have given it. That's the name that shitheads have given it. But what it actually is
it looks really fucking cool.
It looks really cool, but yeah, it's for impotence.
Yeah.
It's for impotence. Yeah.
So he may have written it. He probably didn't. We'll never know for sure, but it exists.
So this is about as close as people think that they have to like a Paracelsian grimoire, right? I'm going to pop in my 2 sentences. Yeah, it was most likely written by Gerhard Dorn, who is a crazy interesting character on his own. I don't know if he's enough for an episode. I might do a Patreon episode about Gerhard Dorn, but it was probably produced in 1570. Johannes Husser included this work within the collected works of Paracelsus. And then since then, because it was included, it's basically been part of the Paracelsian canon. Yeah. Yeah, I don't think it's Paracelsus. It's lots of interesting stuff.
You got stuff on the planets and spirits of planets. There's a thing on alchemy in there that definitely was not written by Paracelsus. There's things about the zodiac, magical cure of diseases, celestial medicines.
And then there's also this bit on like I forget what it's called, but it's like, it's Paracelsus's occult philosophy. It's like the occult philosophy of Paracelsus. And that's where like a lot of his quotes on magic that he doesn't like, supposedly, he calls the things like necromancers, like we're all idiots and deluded. And I do the kind of ritual magic that this supposed occult philosophy of Paracelsus. I don't think Paracelsus cared at that point about like what necromancers were doing. I don't think he gave a shit. I think he was so wrapped up in his own stuff. But this treatise was in the Archidoxes of Magic. Interesting, kind of funny. It's written as if somebody thinks that they can ape the way that they think Paracelsus acted, which is really, I don't know if that makes sense, because it's got like some like spite and some vitriol, but it's like really kind of like elementary. When you read things that Paracelsus has actually said, like, yeah, he's talking about like fir cones and fig trees and like that. He writes in this very flowery way. This kind of reads like, yeah, he's a grump, and I'm going to write it like it's a grump. Like, yeah, it's interesting. The Archidoxes of Magic, it's fun. I'm pretty sure it wasn't written by Paracelsus. It's the one that most people will say is like Paracelsian ritual magic. I haven't done any of the rituals from it. It's just like a curiosity for me.
Yeah. I've never experimented. Lots of astrology, lots of image making.
Yeah.
It's never been one that I've been gung ho about getting into.
Yeah, and truthfully, I've really never heard of anybody nobody's put up on their blog about doing the Archidoxes of Magic or stuff like that.
Yeah. It exists.
It exists. Yeah, it's cool.
Although there is another grimoire, one that a lot of folks have read and gone through the rituals.
The Arbatel, which some people say there's some older copies of this grimoire that have Paracelsus's name on it. It is deeply influenced by Paracelsian philosophy, but it is most likely composed by another guy who might get his own episode, Jacques Gohary, at some point, perhaps, but really interesting guy. Yes. So what is known within this grimoire are called the Olympic spirits. Steve, are you familiar with the Olympic spirits?
Also known as the Olympian spirits.
I am.
Tell us.
The Orbital is actually one of the first, I always struggle calling it a grimoire because it's not really,
No.
but it was one of the first books of magic that I ever really dug into off of recommendation of Josephine McCarthy of all people.
There you go.
The Olympic spirits may or may not be planetary intelligences.
Yeah.
Ish.
Yeah.
They're an odd collection of 7 planetary spirits that just kind of exist in a weird parallel tradition to the Agrippan tradition. And it's a series of prayers and aphorisms that kind of just educate you about them. And it is up to the reader to try to construct some kind of practical application of this. But I find it a lovely little thing to return to every once in a while.
Yeah, I'm going to fully admit I have not worked in huge air quotes the Arbitel because for one, I'm not saying this is, it's very simple. It's literally at a certain time of day you just do a certain prayer in a certain direction.
Yeah,
that's it. And which is why the Arbitel is considered by many people, including everybody's favorite, Dr. Al. He's like, it's the first grimoire that you should probably look at because it's fairly easy to crack. Everybody's favorite, Sam Block as well, also has a way of approaching the Arbitel as a very practical way of getting to know how to use a grimoire. It's interesting. Joseph H. Peterson has a translation. It's very good. But it's very embedded within the elements play a part in there. It brings up the elementals, the Paracelsian elementals. Also, though, probably not written by Paracelsus, but probably hugely influenced by him. But yeah, this is Jacques Gohary character. Interesting character. Look him up. Gohry. Strange cat. I knew about him before. People think that he's the one that put together
the 4th book of occult philosophy.
I think that he's the guy that a lot of people are like, that was his work and he did that. Anyways, interesting stuff. A lot of people will say when you bring up Paracelsus that he is a Rosicrucian. He is one of the Rosicrucian forefathers. So one of the reasons that this is brought up is there's a woodcut portrait of Paracelsus that was done while he was alive. Again, this is the one where he's holding a sword. He's got a window in the background. Interesting. What later happened with this imagery and when people when actual, what we're going to call actual Rosicrucians discovered Paracelsus's work, which was very influential, they started adding bits to this image and one was that they put Azoth, which is an elemental action of Mercury, on the pommel of the sword of Paracelsus. In the background where there's a window, there's a child's head emerging from a grave or a pit. Anyway, I don't want to get too much into this. It all depends what you think the Rosicrucians actually were. I think Rosicrucianism would have confused Paracelsus, or he would have just been indifferent to it. Again, Paracelsus's religious thought is a lot. But Steve, you're fairly familiar with theology and philosophy, probably much more than I am. And I mean that as a compliment, by the way.
I know how you have your opinions about philosophy, Douglas.
Wittgenstein, he broke it. Anyways, but what do you make of his theological writings? I don't want to make too much of it, but yeah, he was anti-papal, but he also admired lots of aspects of Catholicism. He also did not hold a ton of truck with Martin Luther and but what do you make of it?
I've never particularly thought of him as a theological thinker, which is odd because he wrote so much about theology and works that we can guarantee were his. But for the most part, his theology and piety were always in service to his alchemy and medicine. Yeah. So his broad thoughts about the individual and the pursuit of piety and God were always important to him. Things go back to Jesus all the time. He is a good Christian for the most part, even with his most heterodox opinions. Yeah. But yeah, I've never really bought the Rosicrucian thing either.
Yeah. His idea was that there is, like, he mentions this is just like something that he, like, I can just picture him with like a jug of wine. Like, he's not even got a glass, a jug of wine he's just drinking. And he's just like, there's this church of spirit that exists is what we need. We need to have, like, and he did talk about like a church of spirit, which sounds a lot like Rosicrucian. Like the Rosicrucian is a secret order, which has no church. It is within, the temple is within all of us, right? Yeah. If you know what Paracelsus said about his theological writings, and then you try to shoehorn it into Rosicrucianism, it's speculative, and it's very speculative depending on who's doing the speculating. There's a big thing that goes around that's called the prognostications of Paracelsus. So throughout what he wrote, there were these things that sounded like omens or prophecies for the future. Those were later collected by Johann Huser and put into one book called the Prognosticon Theophrasti Paracelsi. This was in the early 17th century. It added to the mythology of Rosicrucianism, and it was fairly popular with people who called themselves Rosicrucians. Yeah, and it got used. A lot of things were happening in Europe, and people would be like, this was what Paracelsus, this was part of his prophecy. And yeah, it's kind of odd, particularly in one instance, he talks about like the 30-year war, but not like by name in Paracelsus. And then like, this is what Paracelsus is talking about, this 30 years war, right? Which was a huge thing within Rosicrucian. If you don't, the Rosicrucians made a big deal out of the 30 years war. I'm not going to get into the history of it because it's so much. But Adam Hasselmeyer, huge writer on Rosicrucianism, again, touched on it briefly in my Rosicrucian episode. Yes, he was influenced by the writings attributed again to Paracelsus. He called Paracelsus's revelations the Theophrasti Sancta, I believe is what it's called. There's so much. The way to cap this off, this mythological part, is that just because his name is on it does not make it necessarily his. Paracelsus. It's easy to kind of identify the things that he's written from the things that he has, because he has this very flowery way of writing. It's really interesting. It's kind of like, I don't want to say Baroque German, but like, because it's very worldly, of the world, but also kind of like he's trying to pretend to be aristocratic, but he's not. It's wonderful. And I think it's at least the translations into English. And again, tons of his stuff hasn't been translated into English. That's why somebody like Frater Osher is actually quite interesting, because he does read German. And a lot of the stuff that he's reading is actual Paracelsus's German that has not been translated into English. So again, he's probably the one I would direct most people's attention to, the writings of Frater Osher. He's very big on Paracelsus. Look him up in his work.
And even then, I think Paracelsus is actually fairly readable for the most part, especially when you're comparing him to Blavatsky, Levy, Crowley. He's not trying to be anything more than he is.
Yeah.
He's old-timey, but for the most part, you can dive into it if you really want to.
Absolutely. The Nicholas Goodrich Clark book, Essential Writings, is fun. It's about 230 pages or so, but it's got some of the stuff translated into English that we know he wrote. It's fun. It's really a really good introduction. It's well worth reading. And here's the thing. It's cheap. If you want to get it through, I don't know, the Evil online bookstore or anywhere else, or the used bookstore, it's well worth having. It's well worth having and flipping through. It's really good information. I think some of the biographical stuff at the beginning is a little outdated, just because we know a little bit more about his life, because this book was produced in the late 80s, I believe. But it's good. Yeah, I agree with everything that Steve says about his writings. It's fun. It's compared to other people, particularly Blavatsky, definitely easier to read as it's translated to English.
I think I found an even better way of saying this. He is not trying to hide anything either. There are no like secrets anywhere. There's no double blinds anywhere. he's just writing about what he has experienced and learned and knows, and is not trying to make initiates out of anybody.
No, it's beautiful. Yes, very well put. Yeah, that's exactly what it is. It's very much just, again, the brain droppings of Paracelsus. He's drunk. He's full of, I don't know, like chicken. And he's just like, this is what I feel is he loved a waterfowl and anyways, duck and chicken. He was a huge fan. Anyways.
Drunken on cock is a good idea to me.
There we go. There we go. Nice. Did you you can't see the video, everybody, but I think he just dabbed.
I did.
My guest just dabbed. I'm old, but even I know what that is. We all make fun of Steve in the Discord because we all call him the youngster, but
not the youngest anymore.
Not the youngest anymore. That's Menway. Anyways, we're getting very meta. Come join the discourse. You can talk to Steve. Steve's pretty much the funniest person on the Discord. There's a lot of us that are really funny.
Thank you.
Anyways, join the Patreon. You get to talk with myself and Steve all the time and post weird gifts. He'll talk to you about Spinoza. He loves Spinoza.
Spinoza's great.
Yeah. Yes. I don't know if I'll ever get around to a Spinoza episode, but
hey, I'm here if you need him.
Oh, right. Sounds good. To get back to Paracelsus, my goodness, nice little diversion there. I hope you enjoyed it. Anyways, the mythological part of Paracelsus is huge. You can't get away from that. And a lot of people, when they say they're talking about Paracelsus and they bring Paracelsian magic in, a lot of it is probably nothing that he wrote. Or he would probably be like, I don't even know what you're talking about there, particularly there's nothing that Paracelsus did that leaned towards talismanic magic. And then there's this book of talismanic magic attributed to him. It's very bizarre. What you take as the spirit of Paracelsus is yours. It's where you draw the line. That's yours as well. A lot of people have what they call Paracelsian magic. Cool. I'm not going to try and shame anybody for doing it. Again, and I say this every episode, I like the mythological aspect of magic. I think magic is real. I think it deserves a true history. And so we can just say that the Archidoxes is not Paracelsus. The Arbocello was not Paracelsus. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. So just use them, but just don't confuse them for Paracelsus's work. But where the myth and where the man actually exists, that's each and every one of your choice as far as this kind of stuff is concerned. All right, we're coming to the end here. Let's talk about why Paracelsus matters. And it sounds like the whole episode. I hope when people are listening to this, they're like, wow, I don't know enough about this guy. If you are having that thought, good, because I thought I did, and I was shocked. I had so much fun trying to relearn some of this stuff and not just relearn it. There was a lot that I did learn that was very new. So while I was doing the research, I came across a paper that basically said that Paracelsus didn't really do that much for medicine, actually. Paracelsus ain't that big a deal as far as medicine is concerned. And when I read this paper, initially I was ambivalent. I was like, this person doesn't know what they're talking about. They have a bit of a point, though. In truth, Paracelsus was in the right place at the right time. He made enough of a splash that a lot of things that were a thing before he was big were kind of somewhat small, that he promulgated them. We kind of attribute it to him, but there's definitely predecessors to Paracelsus as far as medical theories and whatnot are concerned. Yes, his uniqueness, though, did single him out to later generations, particularly people within the philosophy and history of medicine, for sure. I think that what this paper does, though, is that it does go all in on this idea of innovation. Like innovation is something like a clicker that we can click, like this person invented chemistry. I don't think you can do that, not with something as ethereal and as experiential as medicine is concerned. So I think that this paper, I'll have it up in the show notes. It's interesting. It does have a bit of a case, and it's a very short paper. But yeah, Paracelsus, we make a lot of this idea that he did a lot of these things first, and he didn't. He popularized a lot of it after he died, and a lot of people, because he was this very interesting, larger than life figure that we can look to and be like, okay, so he did this, but he wasn't the first. Was he a founder of modern medicine? In a way, I think he was, certainly. I think that what he was a harbinger of many medical disciplines, right? And I think that for Paracelsus, a lot of what he did was in an attitude and approach, which was very fresh at a period of time when we all have this idea that within universities and medical school, it's very hierarchical. It's like the big people talking down to the little people until they get their degree, they become like a doctor. That was even bigger within the universities in the 16th and 17th century. So Paracelsus was enough of a difference maker that he was like, no, it's about experience and approach and actually working, that it really made Paracelsus a figure that stood out. We owe Paracelsus that much. His approach and his attitude was revolutionary, without a doubt. But the spirit of Paracelsus spurred others to do the same. And that's something that you cannot quantify. Influence is not something you can quantify, I think. And that's what this paper gets wrong. Or not wrong. It's just, it negates a very important aspect of Paracelsus. So much of our concepts of alchemy, particularly modern concepts of alchemy, which are more spiritual, I'll say, than technical alchemy, they come from Paracelsus. There is this idea of a chemical worldview, which if you read Lawrence Principe's The Secrets of Alchemy, he talks about Paracelsus and the fact that like there's alchemy pre-Paracelsus and then there's after Paracelsus, and it's much different. And of course, it didn't last that much longer because it eventually became what we call chemistry, right? In some way. But I think personally, that his major contribution magically was the reimagining of various beings and single-handedly adding so much to European beliefs via the things like elementals. And I'm not going to say folklore. Folklore is a term I really do not like, and it only should be used in certain contexts. But I think that the spiritual tapestry of Europe was
irrevocably changed,
made so much richer by single-handedly by Paracelsus. I think he changed everything. And so for such a short treatise, it's really quite amazing that it had as much of an influence as it did. He was influenced by his stories. Yeah, Paracelsus can be anything you want him to be. He's all over the place as far as his writings are concerned. He's much more religious than I think people may take him out to be, particularly occultists. And I'm going to say 20th century occultists, when they look at his work, they leave out a lot of the Jesus stuff because they don't like it, right? But he was very religious, as everybody was back in the time, and particularly in a place like Central and Eastern Europe, where he spent a lot of his time.
I don't think there's a way to like wrap up this man's 48 years that is at all sufficient, other than I would be happy to live even a fraction of the life that he was able to accomplish. Everything that we do at this point as vaguely Western tradition occultists has been radically changed by the existence of him, just because he became popular in the specific way that he did. So I owe him an intense gratitude. He's on my little wall of dead magicians that I love to call up every once in a while and meditate on and read about, and it'll just, he just is there, and it's impossible to get rid of him at this point.
Yeah, and I think when you start to look a little bit deeper, yeah, you are right. His fingerprints are over so much, and it's actually quite, I'm not going to say scary. It's like, shame on a lot of the later generations that they just cribbed from him and didn't give him credit for it. Because, I'm not going to say like all roads lead back to Paracelsus as far as Western ritual magic is concerned, but a lot of it does. And not just the stuff that was like attributed to Paracelsus. Yeah, he single-handedly changed so much within magic for a guy who doesn't have a magic that we can say, like John Dee's got his Enochian stuff. Paracelsus almost doesn't have anything. He's got influential aspects of his work that go through every sinew of Western ritual magic, but he doesn't have a thing we can pick up and be like, this is the book on Paracelsian magic. And no other figure I can think of. Like Crowley's big. I understand the idea of Crowley of like being big, and I have to admit, like, he's a titan. I give him a month, right? But part of me is like, probably could give at least 3 episodes to Paracelsus. And it's one of those things where maybe shame on me a little bit for being like, we can do it in 1 episode, because I don't think you can. Yeah. For me, like most figures in the Fool's Gallery, I pity him in a way. He lived in a very hard period of time, and he was trying to make a difference. He truly was trying to. There's no biography you can read of him that no matter how much of an asshole he was an asshole in a good way, kind of the way that we are. He would never punch down. He saw the working people as being good. I don't want to throw like class politics into this, but like he really thought that the sickest people were usually those people who didn't have money, or there were soldiers fighting on wars that they probably shouldn't have been fighting in the first place to enlarge some rich asshole's territory over another rich asshole that would be gained like another 2 weeks later with another bout of a ton of people dying for no fucking reason. Paracelsus wanted to help these people, and he wanted to help everybody. And so, yeah, he comes as somebody who wanted to make a difference in some way, and his worldview was informed by wanting to make this difference. And how he came at doing this was his. It was crafted through experience and know-how, which at a time seemed very foolhardy, but he is indeed a titan. And I go back and forth as far as his medical accomplishments. A lot of people make a lot of it. I don't know if there's as great as people make him out to be. He is a harbinger. I'd say not a founding father. I think he's a harbinger of modern medical procedure. And the spirit of Paracelsus is throughout all of medicine. I will say that. But his ecosystem of spirits and the elementals is wonderful. I think there's something very special there and worth investigating for all of us. And here's the thing. Most of us that are magicians, if you go to a certain place, and this is something that Paracelsus probably had a lot of times while he was traveling, because even people like Robert Kirk have this happen, and they talk about it. When you go to a certain place, that is, I'm going to use the quote unquote nature, and you feel like there's something else there. It's not just like a feeling of like, this is beautiful and this is all. There's a real presence here. And I know there's something here. Paracelsus is like, there is, and it's real. And that feeling is not something you should just be like, that's my psychology. Like there's something real there. So this idea of fairies, nature spirits, etc., Paracelsus knew that they were real. And I love the fact that he was able to give something that other cultures have made a point of belief to be like almost like the biggest part of their belief system. Paracelsus is like, this should be a part of our belief systems as well. And he gave that a name, and he gave it, he didn't categorize it so much, but he gave it a real agency. I'll say that in the way that atomists like to throw the agency word around. Paracelsus gave the elementals some agency in which they had not had before. And that's amazing. Paracelsus can be all things to all people. If you want to lean into his alchemy, go for it. His astrology, by all means, people have written about it. His religious theology, giver, it's pretty vast. And his magical worldview, absolutely. But there are many directions in which to go with Paracelsus. For Paracelsus, they all intertwined and they fed into each other. And for a world that was as cruel as it was to him, it is no wonder that he wanted to create his own. Because, he had to. And that's the life and times of Paracelsus. My goodness. I don't think this can be one episode, Steve. I think we might have to come back a little bit later on because.
Yeah, I'm happy to. There's so much to dig into. I can talk about him all day.
I was surprised at how much, and this happens because I've been doing this a while, quote unquote. It's 20 years I've been doing magic. And Paracelsus was always that guy that was like, oh, he's the alchemist. He's the medical guy. I knew he's a big figure. And then with this episode, it's like, he's bigger than D. I think he's bigger than D. I agree. I think there are so many of our standard magicians canonically or whatever, your D's, Agrippas, etc., that get, I won't say outsized attention, but hint, hint, wink, wink. And there's Paracelsus actually just kind of writing the magical tradition from the Renaissance forward. Yeah. Yeah, he's an incredible figure. So, Steve, we'll have to have you back because I don't think we can leave it at one episode. This is just an introduction. There's way more that we can talk about here. Like the alchemy stuff, we just glossed over that. Like the elemental stuff, we spent about 25 minutes talking about that. That's still not even, and for such a small, I'll have it up in the show notes because it's part of a collected works, at least the best English translation of this. It's worth a read. And some of you would read it and be like, I don't know what to make of this. Like, it's like, I don't see what the big deal is. But when you understand just through all of these traditions I was talking to you about, I brought up the The Fisherman and His Soul, the story by Oscar Wilde, which is like, that's Paracelsus, is the idea. A fisherman wants to marry a mermaid. How does he get his soul removed? He goes to a witch to remove it. It's incredible.
Yeah, it's all there. It's everywhere as soon as you start looking.
Yeah, it's amazing. So some of the places to go, there's a wonderful series of biographies. The Devil's Doctor by Philip Ball, I believe his name is. There's Paracelsus, Medicine, Magic, and the End of Times by, I believe it's Charles Webster, could be wrong. Anyways, I will have a ton of these in the show notes. There's so many show notes for this episode. I have to say, please check them out. But Steve, thank you for putting your hand up and being like, let's talk about Paracelsus, because I love it. And
I'm glad. I will evangelize my boy as long as we need to.
For sure. And yeah, we'll have you back on the show. Is there a place that people can find you? What are you doing? For those of you who, for the people who aren't on the What Magic Is This Discord, how did this whole magical thing happen let's get a bit of a biography. What's going on here? You've had an interesting life, Steve.
I was a good Catholic boy. And as many people in the Discord have found out, when you're a really good traditional Catholic, it's just magic and shit, it's fine. So been at this for about 10 years now, just slowly introducing life of spirits inside of things, lots of detours, lots of taking everything in, but you can hear me spout about philosophy, theology, Goetia techniques, the nature of spirits, and what we're all doing here. If I throw $7 a month at this man, I guess.
Whoa! Are you? He dabbed again. Thank you for advertising for me. I have to do it this much. No, you also have you're also on Twitter as well.
Yes, I am on Twitter. It's at Steve_Rhino_. I'm not really much of a poster. You'll occasionally see me make weird gay memes, talk about Thelema sometimes, saints sometimes. I'm a bit of an eclecticist, to say the least.
Yeah, it's all good. Steve, thank you so much for being such a lovely presence in the Discord. It's always wonderful. And for a period of time there, you kind of went away. I think you were in a job hunt or something like that. And we all missed your presence, but
I'm back at it. Don't worry.
and I don't know if you noticed, but I wore a rugby shirt for you. Steve plays rugby.
Don't worry, I noticed.
Oh, thank God. Of all places, I bought this in Mexico. Anyways,
sure.
Yeah. But I love Paracelsus. We'll have to have you back on because too much. I didn't realize until after I do notes for all my episodes. So Steve actually got to watch in real time, like what happens. You saw how the sausage gets made. And as I was going through it, I was like, well, now I have to read this book. I think I read 4 books, the best portion of 4 books for this episode. It was kind of crazy, but I loved it. Such an incredible character. And yeah, what a weirdo, but also like really admirable. His cosmology, insane, but cool. Insane, but cool. So I'll just say that. So for this episode, I want each person that finds this interesting, please check out my show notes for this episode. That can be found at whatmagicisthis.com. There's a lot of really great books to grab and buy, wonderful biographies, some amazing links to some other occultists and what they have to say about Paracelsus. It's great. So this is some of my best show notes. So please check those out. And again, that's at whatmagicisthis.com. Also there, you can find a link to my Twitter account, my Instagram account, as well as my Facebook account. I'm pretty active on Twitter. I'm not backing away, but Instagram goes through these, I'll just say Instagram I find very annoying these days. So if you reach out to me through Instagram, I might not get it for a couple of days. That's all I'm saying. But if you want to poke me on Twitter or anything like that, go for it. I'm around on Twitter. That's all I'll say.
If you enjoy the podcast, please tell a friend. Perhaps they'll tell a friend, and then they can tell a friend, and then that's how this friend stuff works. As far as my advertising is concerned, I want you to do it for me. That's all I'm saying. But yes, tell a friend that you enjoy the show. It'd be greatly appreciated. If you enjoy it, I don't know, maybe say something on Apple Podcasts or Stitcher or wherever you can. Just say, you know what, Doug does a pretty good show. Write a couple of sentences. I would love that, particularly on Apple Podcasts or iTunes or whatever the hell they're calling it these days. I keep forgetting what Apple calls there. I think it's Apple Podcasts. Anyways, that would be greatly appreciated. Hey, do you like what I'm doing here on the show? Are you like Steve and you want to support What Magic Is This? Well, that's great, because there's 3 ways of doing that. All right, let's take you through these 3 ways. The first way is where I want to see you, and it's the best way, and it's a way for you to be able to talk to me and to see some extra content and to join a Discord server and all that fun, great stuff that Steve was talking about by signing up to my Patreon. That is patreon.com/whatmagicisthis. $7 a month. That's it. That's nothing. That's chicken feed. That's chicken scratch. I don't know the saying. I thought, are they different sayings, chicken feed and chicken scratch? Who knows? Who cares? Anyway, $7 a month. That is all. I would greatly love to see you support me there. I have about 300 people supporting me so far. Let's make it to 400. Let's make it to 500. Let's make it to 500,000. Anyways, I have tons of great content on there, like videos. I'm going to be putting out a video not too long here about how to scry, how to use a black mirror or a crystal ball or an obsidian showstone on how to scry. I will be doing a video on such things. It's going to be great, and I have lots of great content there. And again, yes, you'd get access to a Discord server where you can talk at Steve. He's lovely. Some of my former guests are on there as well. It's an amazing place. I would greatly appreciate to see you on the Patreon. $7, that's all I'm asking. Patreon.com/whatmagicisthis, or head to whatmagicisthis.com and click any one of the Patreon links. If you don't feel like the $7 a month is, your thing, but you still want to support the show by throwing me a little bit of cash, that's PayPal. So you can go to whatmagicisthis.com, find any one of the PayPal me links, click it. $5, $10, $20, as much as you'd like. It all goes back into making sure that this podcast's run. Hosting's expensive. I had to just pay for some more stuff because, yeah, podcasts, they're like cars. They get you places, but they also cost a lot of money. At least if you want to do it properly, I say, and the best quality. And that's what I try to do. So any donations through PayPal goes right back into making sure that What Magic Is This stays as good as it does. The third way of supporting the podcast is by showing your support by buying a t-shirt or a tote bag or some stickers or notebooks. My gosh, these notebooks are awesome. They look so good. I love them. I've got... Oh man, how many do I have? I have quite a few of them. Anyways, I'm my best customer. I say that every episode, but every time I say it, it's kind of like more sad. Anyways, so head to whatmagicisthis.com, click on the menu there, go to merchandise, and yeah, there's tons of great stuff. Mugs. I've got about 5 mugs. What Magic Is This mugs? They're great. I love them. There's about 6 or 7 logos up there for you to choose from. So many things to pick. It's great. So yes, show some support for the show by wearing your support t-shirts also. It's excellent. I don't see a ton of cash from those, but they look great. And I wear them all the time, and they're just the best. And yeah. But the place I want to see you, it's Patreon. $7. You get to hang with me and Steve and many more people. And yeah, it's the best. $7. That's all I'm asking. It's very little. Anyways, all of those things can be found at whatmagicisthis.com. Head there. And yes, check out the show notes. They're great. Steve, thank you so much. We'll have to have you back on to talk about Paracelsus. And,
yeah, absolutely. I'm happy to.
Perfect. And that's the show, everybody. So I really hope that you got a handle on this Paracelsus guy. And again, just an introduction. We'll maybe in 6 to 8 months we'll have Steve back on here and we'll talk about
Talk about the good doctor, the devil's doctor that is Paracelsus. But until then, I want each and every one of you to stay healthy. Please stay healthy, stay hopeful, and stay luminous, because that's what Paracelsus would want from you. And can we get a goodbye from you, Steve?
Bye, everybody.
Wonderful. And that's the show. We'll talk at you soon. Take it easy, folks. Bye-bye.